course, everybody would love to hear something from the Indian government, but I think it is taken for granted from our side
True.
that India is concerned. India has a stake in all this. So, suppose if the next Dalai Lama is born in India, then he becomes an Indian citizen. So that makes it more relevant for India.
Today, our special guest is Penpa Tsering. He's the Sikyong of the Central Tibetan Administration, the Tibetan government in exile. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. Sikyong, Penpa Tsering, thank you so much for giving us time. I do know you've just come back from a very fruitful US visit, especially in the light of what's been happening in terms of the Resolve Tibet Act, which President Biden signed into law, I think, while you were on US soil. But even though it's completely a definitive move forward, in your view, Sikyong, for concrete action, not just statements, what needs to be done further?
The whole idea of moving the Resolve Tibet Act is to focus on several of the issues that were raised in the act itself, which talks about Tibet being an unresolved conflict or dispute, and that it should be resolved under the framework of international law. The Tibetan peoples had right to self-determination. United States not accepting China's narrative on Tibet's history. The China claims as Tibet being part of China since ancient times, countering that claim, and then also defining Tibet's territory. All this is aimed at countering what China has been saying to the world so far. And the whole idea is to promote negotiation. And His Holiness is very committed to the middle way policy, and we also remain very committed to the middle way policy. It's not something that I can change just because I'm the Sikyong or the parliament can change. Even if we need to change, it has to go through a certain process of referendum. So that being said, the idea is to force China to come on the negotiating table. And the focus of the Central Tibetan Administration, led by our Kashat right now, is to see how can we convince China to come on the negotiating table based on this argument on the historical status. So now the next step is, if China does not respond, of course they don't respond positively, they are always in denial mode or on everything, then we'll have to seek approval from other countries to take similar positions as the United States. So that is where we need to work on. And I have always said that we have to keep our expectations realistic with it. One thing is, if we have to seek a resolution to the Sino-Tibet conflict through non-violent means, then it could be only through negotiations that could be mutually beneficial both for the Chinese people and the Tibetan people. Yes. And that would be lasting. Any non-violent solution would be lasting. That is why I always appreciate media for covering non-violent movement, where it's too much, today there's too much focus on violence. Let us see whether how China responds to all this, and then how international community also responds to this. It is a significant milestone in our movement. So I keep saying it is something to celebrate for Tibetans, because when the world hears about Tibet, it is mostly because of the sufferings of Tibetans inside Tibet, or because of His Holiness' personal charisma and his deeds around the world. It's very rare that a government takes a decision and then Tibetans rejoice. But for us who has to do the job, it's just the beginning of next level. To take it to the international community, because China tries to seek legitimacy of their rule over Tibet through the international community, because they know that they have no legitimacy of their rule in Tibet in whatever sense. that is our focus, and that is how we need to move forward. One is that, of course, if you have to seek a non-violent solution, then there's no other way than by reaching out to the Chinese. So till such a time, we have to reach out to the international community, because that is what China has been doing. They have been coercing every country to say that Tibet is part of PRC, and we have to counter that narrative.
In terms of countering that narrative, Sikyong, now, even though you're saying this is a milestone, the Resolve Tibet Act, which is law now in the US, and that it puts focus on the fact that the anti-China narrative or the anti-CCP narrative, which is that Tibet was always part of China. But still in the now law, it still says that it says what China calls the Tibetan Autonomous Region and other parts of Tibet are part of PRC. How isn't that a dichotomy on one side saying that Tibet has never been part of China, but it's still accepting the US position, bipartisan position there also, right?
Yeah. But the law itself does not talk about that.
The president, correct.
After he signed into an act, mentioned that, and I have always been saying we have to separate these two issues. Our focus was to counter China's false narrative on Tibetan history.
Right.
Because presently, Tibet is an occupied country under the Chinese rule. And that is the present situation, present position of the U.S. administration that we cannot change. It's up to them to change. But countering China's false narrative on Tibetan history itself can mean a lot of things when things change in future, because things are changing all the time. Even now, inside China also, there are a lot of changes happening, or possible changes that could happen. We can even look at a lot of different scenarios as to where China is going, politically, militarily, economically. There are a lot of things that troubles China. So looking at different scenarios, then what are the opportunities and what are the challenges for Tibet? Those are also things that we need to look into very, very deeply and explore possibilities for future.
India is a big part of the whole actual Tibetan story, right? I mean, we know that. But when you're saying you would have to start exploring whether other countries should pick up similar kind of policy actions, is the CTA doing that, say, with India? What I'm asking is, say, for example, a BJP appointed Rajya Sabha MP from Sikkim recently in Parliament has advised the government that all government agencies, including the military, the ITBP, any bodies, should be referring to the whole LAC from Ladakh, Sikkim to Arunachal, not as the China border, but as the Tibet border. How are you moving the CTA? What is it doing vis-a-vis India's stand on that? For example, as a media, we would always refer to it as the Tibet border or the China-occupied Tibet border. But the government, the position is not quite that.
Now that's something for the government of India to decide. As I was saying, the other reality is that when we reach out to the international community, we don't expect that country, including India, to leave aside their national interests for the interests of Tibet. And that is understood, I think, by everybody. And India has to understand its own national security from that perspective. So when you talk about Indo-Tibet or Indo-China borders, I keep saying India still have not changed the Indo-Tibetan border force or Indo-Tibetan border police in certain areas of the border areas. Now you have the Sikkim member of parliament speaking about this. Earlier you have Penpa Tsering, the Honorable Chief Minister of Arunachal, also says that we don't have a China border, we have a Tibet border. So those also underlines the position of the Indian government, even though it's not very explicit. So the whole reality is that where was China when the United Kingdom or British India invaded Tibet in 1904? Or for that matter, why did China not ratify the Shimla Agreement, which was ultimately signed by independent Tibet and British India, which defines the McMahon line? So all these realities also need to be taken into account when India considers or reconsiders its position. And I've also been saying that it's time to recalibrate, because there are a lot of changes happening geopolitically and geostrategically. Also, a lot of things are changing in the region. So you cannot have a very dogmatic or a very traditional approach to this. I think things will have to evolve as things changes globally.
Talking about things changing and naming and renaming, China's narrative with Tibet has already done that, and constantly doing that in terms of renaming places. It's been doing that with Arunachal Pradesh and Ladakh as well. The CTA, I do believe, is working on a larger historic map and naming of Tibetan places. When do you think, Sikyong, that would be ready? And are you working with the Indian government on that?
No, we are not working on Indian government on that. We have only one cartographer, a Tibetan cartographer, in New Jersey and in Princeton University. We plan to work with him, because that's also one of his area of interest. So the naming and renaming of places does not happen only in Arunachal or Ladakh or in Tibet. Of course, in Tibet, it was part of their early hegemonistic ambitions. Now it's expanding into larger areas, into India, in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea. So they're using Chinese name for all these places in East China or South China Sea, or in areas they claim to be part of their own in the Indian territory. So that is, even though China is always in the denial mood that they don't have hegemonistic ambition, it proves that. And many years ago, I think about 10 years ago, when China declared its air identification zone, air defense identification zone, I was telling some of our US friends that when China claims the air, they'll claim everything under that air, whether it's a sea or land. So that's exactly what happened over the years. If China does not leave aside their hegemonistic ambitions, does not improve their human rights situations in the whole of China, including the data security law, the national security law, or the anti-espionage law, there will not be trust from any governments towards China. China today has military power, it has political power only because of its economic power. So, but the only thing they lack is the moral power. Nobody trusts them. That is why China will have to take one position or the other. They cannot have both. They cannot have their hegemonistic ambition in the region and also have good business relations with other countries, because that is what they want. That's what they need right now, because they have a lot of problems. So other nations will also have to identify where China's weakness is. That is why I keep telling the Europeans also, it's good that you are supporting Ukraine with military equipments and all that. It's important that Ukrainians need to defend themselves. Otherwise, it might have a lot of implications in Europe or elsewhere with China or Taiwan. But since we follow non-violence, I keep telling them that one thing that can bring China on its knees is economic. If you look at Europe-China business trade balance, you're talking about 27 European countries exporting only 200 billion to China and importing 600 billion every single year. So you're talking about 400 billion US dollars trade deficit with China. And you add, on top of that, you add the trade deficit with the United States, with India, and now China's pivot towards the global south. When China has all the foreign exchange reserve, then they can splurge it on space technology, they can splurge it on military, the artificial intelligence, quantum computing, or the high-end microchips, whatever the Belt and Road Initiative, creating a lot of dead economies around the world. This they cannot do if they don't have this excess of foreign exchange reserves. So the only way to bring China on its knees is to give them less business. Then only they will listen to the world. Otherwise, they will not. And unless the governments don't understand that, then it will be very difficult to handle China. Because China will keep doing what they want to do, not listen. Because their ambition is not now necessarily restricted to the rise of China in proper China. They are talking about global security initiative. They are talking about global cultural and civilizational initiative, global economic initiative. So it's all global. They want to export their system of governance. They align all the, they are the biggest bully in the world, and they want to align all the smaller bullies around them. So create a new global order or competition to the Western democratic world that also includes India being part of that sphere. Because ultimately, whether we agree or not, it is a fight between ideologies of democracy and autocracy.
And again, when you're talking about naming and renaming and these narratives which are then tried to be built up as part of historical evidence, so-called evidence, but what is the CTA's position, say, vis-a-vis Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh? Are they incontrovertibly Indian, or is there some dispute? Suppose Tibet was independent. Would there be a dispute about it?
We are the main stakeholder in this whole border issue.
Yeah.
We were signatory to the Shimla Agreement that defines the Indo-Tibetan border on map online. So we stick to that. It is an agreement that was made by independent Tibet, and we stuck to that, in which sense, of course, Ladakh, Laos, Spiti, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, Arunachal Pradesh, all has, because of its proximity of border with Tibet, has cultural influence, which again came from India. So it's originally Indian. It's coming back to the Indian borders over the centuries. So those cultural relations with the Himalayan states continues as it used to be. But territorially, politically, they are part of India. We accept that. There is no two ways about it.
It's interesting that you pointed out, say, for example, the Indo-Tibetan Border Police is still called the Indo-Tibetan Border Police. It's not called the Indo-China Border Police. But just again, what can you share with us about Tibetans under, say, Indian command for decades now in the armed forces, whether it's the SFF or the Vikas battalions? They've been involved in Bangladesh is in the news of late. Bangladesh's independence, liberation, they were involved. Kargil, they were involved. They've been involved in action against the PLA as well. Tibetans in the armed forces under Indian command, what can you share with us about their role? And how important is that for Tibet?
It was a secret.
Correct.
Now it is all over the social media, not coming from the Tibetans. When we say secret, whom are we hiding this from? We are hiding this from the Chinese.
Yes.
But the Chinese government knows everything about the military installations on the border, including the Special Frontier Force which the Tibetans represent. So this came about historically, only after the 1962 war. We came into exile in 1959. We had this association with the special operations of the United States since 1956-57. Then only after 1962 war, India realized the importance of Tibetans in India, and they decided to recruit the Tibetans, and these Tibetans were trained by the Americans, and this establishment was started. Even in 1964, there was a joint office of Indian Tibetans and the Americans in Saket.
Yes.
So since then, the recruitments have been happening, and they are playing a very important role in the sense that Tibetans have the lungs to live on high mountains. We lived on the Tibetan plateau for so many centuries or for millennia. So they serve, I think, a very useful purpose, and it's also, I say, a payback in terms of the hospitality that the Indian government has rendered to the Tibetans through the most difficult period of our history, giving refuge to His Holiness and some 85,000 Tibetans who preceded and followed His Holiness way back in 1959-60. So Tibetans in the Indian Army still plays a very positive role. Well, you mentioned about the Bangladesh war, you mentioned about Kargil, even the present conflict in Ladakh. So we are very proud that we are able to play a positive role in defending India's territory.
And how, if you can help us understand, within the Tibetan circle, say in India, who make decisions, and now generations are changing, right? And is the new generation getting more irritated with progress not being achieved as fast as they want? Is there a strand which suggests that there should be armed resistance or struggle? Even though I know you talked about the whole process of the middle way not being changed so simply, but is that something that is internally discussed or debated within Tibet?
No, inside Tibet there is no chance.
No, I'm talking about
within
outside.
the Tibetan community in diaspora, there have been discussions in the 70s, 80s, when the Tibetan Youth Congress was formed, but there was no serious discussion on taking up arms, because one reason is because His Holiness keeps saying that if Tibetans take up arms, I will no more be responsible for the Tibetan cause. So that also could be a deterrence for Tibetans to take up violence. But even otherwise, pragmatically, how could it work? We are only 6 million Tibetans now, maybe about 7.3 million Tibetans inside Tibet. And it's 1.4 billion Chinese. So even if we take up arms, what are the probabilities of success through violence? Even whether discarding the fact of debate between the merits and demerits of violence and non-violence, even if it is possible for the Tibetans to take up violence, how viable would it be to fight against 1.4 billion Chinese? So, and that would give Chinese more emanation in terms of suppressing the Tibetans. Because one thing that the Chinese government does not understand is how to handle non-violent movements. They've been studying a lot of other non-violent movements around the world, but every non-violent movement is of different nature. So it's if you use force, if you use violence, then it becomes very easy for the Chinese to say, oh, they are terrorists, or they're doing this, doing that, and then defame us internationally. And internationally also, it will be difficult to get support for violence activities.
Sikyong, you have elaborated at length about the middle way and two polarities, why it's middle way and the two extreme polarities. But do you agree with, say, analysts or historians like Claude RP, who suggest that there should be a third polarity? What they mean is India. So if there are any consultations, negotiations, back channel talks, that India's point of view should also be incorporated in that. What are your thoughts on something like that?
I'm sure as and when there are some progress, then there would be involvement of third parties. One thing is that China does not appreciate involvement of
I didn't mean parties. I mean the third polarity. When you said the two poles as the extremes and the middle way, should there be a third pole? Maybe not India as a party, but that India's views should be maybe...
India's views are definitely very, very important, because India is the only country that has a complete understanding of Tibet's history in the past. Even now, sometimes I get this feeling, does Indian experts really know about Tibetan history also? Because sometimes people say, oh, Tibet became independent during the 13th Dalai Lama's time, after the signing of McMahon Line, Shimla Agreement and all that. But they fail to study the history beyond that. China's claim to Tibet is 7th century, 13th century, 18th century, whereas India as a neighbor, of course, we never had a war, we never had that much of an interaction as much as it should have been happening between two neighboring countries because of the topography of Tibet, because of the geographical location of Tibet being too high, no transportation. But you can imagine the Tibetan masters from late 9th century to 13th century who came cross into Tibet, into India many times to learn from Indian masters, go back to Tibet. And those, if you think physically, today, if somebody has to walk from Tibet to India, it'll be very difficult. But those days, even under very difficult circumstances, the Tibetan masters came over, took that pain to learn from India as much as they could. So the relation between India and Tibet, I think not many people know that there are also historical analysis that the first king of Tibet came from India, going back 2,200, 2,300 years ago. Then Tibetan script coming from India, the Tibetan Buddhism also coming from India. So we consider ourselves as an extension of an ancient Indian wisdom. And His Holiness always says, I am a messenger of India, or the ancient Indian wisdom. So that is how we look at India from that perspective, the land of Aryavrat, the land of Buddha. So we have so much respect for India. So, and the Indian historians also need to understand China-Tibet historical relations, because China's claim over Tibet in 7th century, 13th century sounds hollow right now, because they keep changing their goalposts all the time. Now, I don't know whether, I've not heard, of course, Claude is a very old friend. We lived together in Pondicherry for many years.
Was that the time when you had a restaurant? Is that the time, or was it before that?
Time.
Yeah.
10 years in Pondicherry, 10, 11 years in Pondicherry. So we both know each other. I fail to understand how, in what context he said India could be a third pole in that, because we were talking about
I presume he's talking about if there's any new initiative in these back channel talks, or that India's position should be on board. Paraphrasing what he's saying.
No, that is fine. I think from that perspective, it's fine. Yeah. Whether you can have call India a third pole or not, that is something in terms of polarities. Which when we talk about polarities, we are talking about positions of Tibet, the present situation of Tibet under the occupied by China, which is very repressive rule, independent status. But India coming as third pole. Of course, India's significance in getting involved in such an progressive movement, if there is any in the times to come, would be welcome. It's something that Indian government has to decide. We cannot force Indian government to take positions on ours, and that's why I keep saying India will have to consider its own national interests.
And the CCP would probably never allow it anyway.
As long as we can align Tibetan interests with Indian interests, then we can move together. So if Indian government does not see the use of aligning their interests with the Tibetan interests, then we will move nowhere.
Understood. Again, Sikyong, these back channel talks, like who have they been between, and what is this third country or party that has been involved?
No, I think
and how much progress?
Reported.
Right.
So I was asked when was the last meeting in the same place here. Yeah. I said it was beginning of last month. It was July beginning. And I was asked, it happened in a third country. I said it happened in a third country. And then some misreported saying that the third country was involved in facilitating that. It's not worth talking about also. It has been 1.5 years since the initiatives came from them, but there is no forward movement. It's just more or less like sending messages, and Chinese still believe that they can buy us out. Just like they think they can buy everybody out. In China, you have the huge anti-corruption move, but they are corrupting every other politician in every other country whom they think they can buy. So what they say and what they do are totally two different things.
On that line of corruption of a different kind, Has there been moves over the years and decades of, when I say China, I'm obviously being the CCP and Xi Jinping, infiltrating the Tibetan movement, Tibetan government, Tibetan decision makers? Has there been any?
That's happening all the time.
All the time.
It's happening all the time, but unfortunately, they are not able to achieve anything. Of course, now in this age of social media, we know of certain people who are being used by Chinese government. We also know for a fact that they pay people money to get information. But then they have so many agencies in China. You have the federal national security, the state level, the military intelligence, you have the United Front Work Department. So many agencies doing so many things, and then they get fed with a lot of information which are real, which are not real. So at the end of the day, they are not able to see which information is right or wrong. And then the question is, who is collecting all this information? What are they passing on to the top leadership, and what top leadership are they able to reach? So these are all huge questions, because the problem with communism is everybody tends to lie. They don't really tell the truth to their superiors, and the superiors also don't get the full information. So that is definitely a problem, and we know the transnational repression is also going on within the Tibetan community. So there are a lot of self-censorship also. The only weapon that Chinese government uses is to deny visa for people to come back to Tibet, visit their families, and that is exactly what they are doing to people in the international arena also, like sanctioning Mecca One. He doesn't have a single property in China, but they want to freeze all his property, all that. So now people don't feel intimidated. They know that this is China's way of doing things, and they have to learn to live with it if they are confronting China.
And with the passing of the torch, so to speak, and generations changing, how do I put this? Is there any danger of the Tibetan movement getting weakened because of the distance that generations would have from the original being in Tibet? And also, are you worried about the number of people, say, who are even leaving India, Tibetans, to go to other developed countries? Does that dilute the Tibetan cause in any way?
I think there are different ways to look at it.
Right.
If I consider the present situation compared to our generation when we were growing up as youngsters, I think the interest is more, the knowledge is more, the awareness is more. Because when we were growing up, we didn't have much information. So China is closed. Even now, China is closed to many information. But after we came into office, even my predecessors also gave a lot of attention to the youth. That is the reason why we have a lot of youth. So some people whom you mentioned on your program also are part of that. Youth. So we also give a lot of focus to the youth. We have created this platform called the Voluntary Tibet Advocacy Group. So one thing is, one challenge here in India and Nepal is the dispersing compact communities, because of which we have been able to preserve our identity over the last 65 years. And that's all because of His Holiness' long-term vision. But the other thing, the opportunity is also that now you have Tibetans in more than 25 different countries. So all of them are young, educated, they have become citizens there, they speak the language, they understand the system. So if they understand a little more about global politics and its impact on Tibet or China, or what is happening inside China and what's happening inside Tibet, then they cannot be a better advocate for Tibet than Tibetans themselves. So that is why when we travel outside, we make it a point to meet with the younger generation separately. And our whole idea was to motivate them to take up future leadership. And we come back inspired by the youth about how they receive their responsibilities in a manner that we were not really expecting. But the interest from the Tibet community is particularly the youth are showing now.
That's wonderful to hear. Again, Sikyong, you met the Dalai Lama in upstate New York on your trip there. He's recuperating well. But do they foresee, the doctors, when he could possibly come back to Dharamsala? When will his, not only Buddhist followers, but followers of all kinds, be able to see him in Dharamsala, in Ladakh, in Arunachal, wherever he used to travel before?
So I sought an audience with His Holiness on 29th of last month, on the 9th of July. And His Holiness said, my knee is improving. So one can imagine he's 89 years of age. Even people who are much younger undergo such surgeries, take several months to recover. And last few years, His Holiness has been supported from both sides, so it will take some time for him to rebuild his muscles, and physical therapy or physiotherapy are happening. Right now, I'm sure there will be announcement very soon about his return back to India.
That's very good to hear again. But is there any clarity about the Dalai Lama's wishes himself? I know he's talked about it many times. Everybody's talked about it a lot. On reincarnation, emanation, succession, how should that be handled? Because it's viewed as such an important aspect of Tibetan culture, and because the CCP is trying to control that process.
Yes. Now, the only document that is available on His Holiness reincarnation is September 2011 document, which talks about when His Holiness reaches the age of 90, he would consult the hierarchy within the Buddhist community. So that still stands, and we are still about 10 months away from His Holiness reaching the age of 90, which is July 6, 2025. So let's wait up to that period, because right now His Holiness has not come out with any statement post September 2011 document. So it will be decided by His Holiness and His Holiness alone, because he is the one who is going to be reborn. And in the process of reincarnation that is very unique to Tibetans, it's a Lama who has to decide where he is going to be reborn and what form, whether it's an emanation or reincarnation. That's why I keep saying, even when His Holiness reaches the age of 90, if he feels good, he might say it's too early. Because one thing China cannot handle is unpredictability. So they don't know when His Holiness talks about emanation, which means choosing somebody before one's own demise, or reincarnation, that's finding a new body, next life. Sometimes when he is asked whether it could be a women Dalai Lama, he says, why not? So all the options are very open. And one thing Chinese cannot handle is unpredictability. That is why they could not handle President Trump. I read a local newspaper in Thailand once, where they says the Chinese business people are going to the oracles to find out what Trump is going to decide next. So even in this case also, if His Holiness decides now, then China has all the economic power and the influence over the global south particularly, and they reshape these countries' thinkings. So I think His Holiness is also being very strategic about his approach. But we can be very, very sure that he and he alone will be responsible for his reincarnation, and he will definitely leave signs and indications regarding his reincarnation.
And if and when those signs do come, whether it's 90th or later when he decides that, would you again agree with some analysts who say, we were talking about recalibration of positions, countries' positions in a changing world. Would you agree with analysts who say that it's time that India should also recalibrate its Tibet policy in terms of, even if you take a small step, what the suggestion was that why can India not say, for example, something as simple as we would welcome the 15th Dalai Lama, whoever he or she is, the way we welcomed the 14th. That's it. Not where they are from. We're not interfering in the process, obviously, unlike the Chinese. But just to make it clear.
Yeah, well, of course, everybody would love to hear something from the Indian government, but
Yeah.
I think it is taken for granted from our side
True.
that India is concerned. India has a stake in all this. So, suppose if the next Dalai Lama is born in India, then he becomes an Indian citizen. So
Right.
that makes it more relevant for India. So I'm sure the Indian authority is really thinking about and working on all this. And when they say it, what they say, it would be something for them to decide. I keep saying I'm nobody to advise the Indian government. I seek advice from the Indian government.
And Sikyong, Penpa Tsering, thank you so much for your time and all your patience and giving us all your experience to us and all our viewers on StratNews Global.
Thank you so much, Amitabh, for having us.
Pleasure's been all ours.
Thank you.
And for all our viewers, do send us feedback. You can follow all our social medias for the latest that we put up on our website or interviews like this with the Sikyong on our YouTube channel. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.